Hello and welcome to the Skiing Weatherman's Pattern Overview. This is December 2nd. I'm Herb Stevens, a skiing weatherman, and as a meteorologist who skied my whole life, I am constantly tuned in to what's going on with the weather as it relates to snow conditions nationwide. And I want to share the meteorology with you through the season. So I'm going to be producing these videos on a weekly basis for snowcountry.com. And Tuesday is probably the most likely day that we will produce these. There'll be a little bit of a fluctuation in the schedule from time to time. But what I want to do is try and give you a little education as to why the weather does what it does in the wintertime. I know most of you are very interested in what and when, but I'm going to delve into the why as well as the what and the when in these discussions. And right now, from coast to coast, things are relatively quiet, but I don't anticipate it's going to stay that way for very long. We've enjoyed a colder than normal November over a good part of the country, and that was consistent with an analog year that I developed and identified, one that I think is going to guide the way the weather performs this winter, and that's 1976, 1977. And 77-78 is also an analog that I have used. And in both of those winters, after a strong start with a cold November, the weather sort of took a time out in early December. And to some extent, to a large extent actually, across the country, that's what's going on right now. Now, there are some problems to talk about. There is this area of winter weather advisories and freezing rain advisories from the mid-Atlantic up into the interior Northeast. That's going to unfold tonight, Tuesday night, and during the day on Wednesday. We have one area with winter storm warnings out here in the Sierra as a moist flow is coming in from the Pacific, and we're looking at probably 1 to 2 feet of snow above 7,500 feet through the Sierra, and that's good news at Mammoth and around Tahoe and further north. And this snow is going to be fairly high moisture content, but at this time of year, that's exactly what you're looking for in terms of base building snow. Elsewhere, there is nothing in the way of dramatic winter weather to talk about, and the jet stream pattern helps to explain why that is the case. If we take a look at today's jet stream at roughly 16,000, 17,000 feet, we've got a broad trough over central Canada, and it extends down into the northern plains states, and this is where some of the cold air is bottled up for the time being. We've got a pretty vigorous storm offshore of California by a couple hundred miles. That's what's pivoting the moisture into the Sierra and going to cause the snow along the Sierra. But as that moisture tries to go east of the Sierra into the Wasatch and into the Tetons, a lot of the moisture will have been wrung out by the first round of encounters with the mountains, the coastal ranges, and then the Sierra themselves, so that the snow that's going to fall over the Wasatch into the Tetons and into the northern Rockies over the next few days, by comparison, will be quite light. Again, we're looking at 1 to 2 feet falling in the Sierra between now and sometime later Thursday. In the east, well, it has warmed up a couple of times this week, and we have a fight going on with a west-southwesterly flow between some relative warmth over the southeastern part of the country and cold air over Canada, and the cold air is not especially deep. So where you have this fight between the two air masses, you end up with snow, sleet, freezing rain, and some rain. And this mixed precipitation scenario is going to play out over the Northeast over the next 24 hours, actually all the way from about Snowshoe and Canaan Valley in West Virginia up into the mountains of Maine. Now, the further north you go, the more snow we're probably going to see out of this scenario, and there'll be anywhere from 2 to maybe 4 inches of snow from the Adirondacks across the northern Greens, the Whites, and into the mountains of western Maine. But even in these mountains, there'll be a little bit of sleet and freezing rain before the system pulls out, and that'll be sometime later Wednesday into Thursday. So if we look at tonight's surface map, there's high pressure over Montana, another center here in British Columbia, and that's helping to circulate cold air into the middle of the country. And the area that's most like winter and has been consistently through November into December is the upper peninsula of Michigan and northern lower Michigan. These ski areas are off to a pretty good start, and some light lake effect snow will help them from time to time over the course of the next several days. But it's this messy thing here in the Mid-South with one area of low pressure in eastern Kentucky, another one trailing in northern Alabama. They're going to head in a generally northeasterly direction, and there's some cold air banked up over the Northeast thanks to this high pressure center that delivered the cold in the last 18 hours or so. So initially it'll start as snow, but as more mild air gets into this system over the course of the next day or so, the precipitation is going to mix and change to something a little less desirable than snow. This is Wednesday morning surface map, and then we go ahead to Wednesday night. The cold front will be moving through the northeast. There'll be some backlash snow in the mountains, but this is not a big event, but it is going to produce a little bit of snow, as I say, from the Adirondacks over to western Maine. Meanwhile, in the west, no major systems are on the map. The upper level low will sit offshore. It'll continue to try and spin energy in to the mountains of the west, but there's no real organization to what's going on right now. And aside from some light snow that'll be rather persistent from the Tetons around Jackson Hole down to Solitude, where, by the way, Solitude outside of Salt Lake City has 50 out of 66 trails open right now, so they're off to a pretty good start. But this light snow will be the focus of the snow that falls over the next 4 or 5 days in the west. Jackson Hole is reporting about 65 out of 116 trails. They've had 10 inches of snow in the last 24 to 36 hours, and they'll add another 6 to 8 over the next couple of days. Maybe they'll open up some new terrain. Certainly that will keep the surfaces soft. Down here in the southeast, don't want to forget about these folks. They're playing a bit of a waiting game right now because these cold fronts that are moving to the east coast don't have a lot of Arctic air with them. There's a little touch of Arctic air in the northeast, but certainly not down in the southern Appalachians. So the snowmaking opportunities are going to be few and far between for the next 4 or 5 days anyway in the southeast, despite their high base elevations, and it'll be hunt and peck snowmaking in the northeast too. Thursday night looks like the best night to get some base depths built up with the temperatures being favorable thanks to clear skies. Friday morning, high pressure will extend down the eastern seaboard. This high is going to produce the clear skies Thursday night that will allow some radiational cooling and drop those temperatures. Meanwhile, by the time we get to Friday, high pressure will be dominating in the west as well. If we take a look at the precipitation in liquid form anticipated over the next 5 days, you can see here in the battle zone between the cold air to the north and the warmer air to the south, that's where you'll find precipitation in the eastern half of the country. And in the west, most of this will be from that storm that is now offshore, spinning the moisture in from the Pacific. These numbers are overdone, but you get the idea that from the southern Sierra through the northern Sierra, that's where the bulk of the precipitation will be. And a lot of these impulses that come in from the west tend to split when they come in at this time of year, so there'll be some energy trying to get into the southwest, although any snow in the mountains of northern New Mexico will be very light, and then the other piece of energy will tend to split and head up into the northwest, and there too the amounts are going to be on the light side. So where do we go from here after the next 5 days? Well, if you've looked at your point-and-click forecast, especially in the eastern half of the country, it's trying to suggest a big warm-up next week, and I just don't believe it. The Canadian ensembles, this is a combination of a couple of dozen forecasts for the jet stream level from the Canadian Weather Service, are forecasting in 7 days a ridge in the west and a trough in the east. This is the setup we saw much of last winter. And a lot of it's tied to this low that's south of the Aleutians, and the position of this low is going to determine just where the ridge sets up and where the trough sets up. And the Canadian, I think, has the right idea. If we look at the European forecast model for the same time frame, this is next Tuesday, it too is trying to build a ridge in the west, dig a trough in the east, and perhaps even spin up a storm along the coast. So there could be some natural snow over the interior sections of the east early next week. But what I'm looking at is the establishment of the western ridge, eastern trough, because I think that is the favored setup for much of this winter as it was last winter. That's good news for some, not so good for others. One of the keys to determine who gets snow and who gets other forms of precipitation, the temperatures at 5,000 feet. Now, that doesn't necessarily hold out here in the west because the mountains are taller than 5,000 feet. But in the eastern two-thirds of the country, if you're in the blue, and this is at the same time that we saw the low-pressure center sitting off at Cape Cod, if you're in the blue, it's probably cold enough for snow. And what this is telling me is there's going to be a battle somewhere from parts of Maine all the way down the Appalachians if this storm forms early next week, and that's something we'll have to keep an eye on, just how much cold air will be available if a low-pressure center decides to run the coast. Now, 10 days from now, the Canadian ensembles like the idea of the eastern trough and the western ridge. I generally like that idea, but the point-and-click source. The GFS forecast model doesn't like that idea. This is what it has 10 days from now, with a ridge in the east and the trough trying to make inroads to the west. I think this trough will be further offshore. That'll allow more room for a western ridge, and I do think there'll be an eastern trough. And the GFS doesn't even agree with itself, because this forecast of the PNA, or Pacific North American Teleconnection, is forecasting a change to a positive PNA. What does that mean? Well, a positive PNA is when we have a western ridge, eastern trough. As you can see, much of November we had a positive PNA, and that explains why it was cold in the upper Midwest to the East Coast. If this thing goes back to a positive PNA, as the GFS is forecasting, well, its jet stream map can't be right. And here's a positive PNA in terms of temperatures: warm in western Canada and the extreme western U.S., and colder than normal over much of the east. That's where I think we're headed. The 15-day Canadian ensembles agree, and we'll just see how that plays out. But I think the point-and-click forecasts are off base for the week of the 8th of December. So in summary, we have a couple of messy small events in the east coming up this week. The point-and-click forecast of a warm-up for next week are overdone. The eastern trough is gradually going to reform next week, while the cold, if you want consistent cold, it's going to hold on along the upper Midwest, along the Canadian border, where they will get many glancing blows of Arctic air, and that'll keep their surfaces winter-like, while the rest of the country is kind of dealing with variable surfaces for the foreseeable future. The Pacific systems that try and come ashore are going to split and weaken over the course of the next week, but there will be some new snow coming up in the Tetons and in the Wasatch Range, but it'll be on the light side over the next 4 to 5 days, and a pretty good storm in the next 48 hours in the Sierra. And the signs, to me, point to the winter locking into its favorable pattern somewhere between the 15th and the 20th. That is the summary for this time. Hopefully you'll click back on snowcountry.com and check out next week's report. I'm Herb Stevens, the Skiing Weatherman. Enjoy your sliding.